Hi, everyone. In this short presentation, the intention is to highlight a few key characteristics of the work of a few architects based in Africa, North and South, in France, in Europe, and in Latin America, with a specific interest on their approach towards social elements. A starting point is the complexity theory of the French sociologist Edgar Morin, who talks about what is woven together and that cannot be torn apart without losing the overall pattern, without losing the connection, the interrelationships, the interactions, and the emergent properties. In our case, this is something that we apply when it comes to the pillars of sustainability, that being environment, economy, society, and culture. And the emphasis in this presentation is going to be this shift from environmental aspects to social elements. We start with the work of Diébédo Francis Quéré in Africa, particularly his home country, Burkina Faso. What is key in this case is how local African construction and land use planning traditions that are based on climatic principles are combined to more sophisticated Occidental technical processes. What Quéré does is transpose the ecological rationalism of Germany, where he studied architecture, to the climatic and social conditions of Burkina Faso. He therefore creates an endogenous economic sector, and he treats equally indigenous and imported architectural cultures, making it possible to seek the right balance between the climatic logics of Western countries and the economic solidarity of vernacular society. What is very important is that he situates the development of each man and for all men at the center of his work process. And that's why he considers architecture as a means of satisfying a social need whilst applying his principle of help to self-help. His projects often have a ripple effect, as highlighted by the Aga Khan Foundation. The projects being often educational, there is a social angle, for instance, allowing access to education or to culture. There is an economic benefit since there is the development of construction skills and learning of new building techniques, training local people and allowing them to earn money out of that process. And there are also cultural implications thanks to the valorization of local materials and endogenous architectural traditions. Karin Smuts in South Africa talks about social performance per square meter as opposed to energy performance or environmental performance. In her work, the inhabitants are involved in the building process to adapt the program, to question the program, to introduce missing functions, and ultimately transform disadvantaged neighborhoods into places of exchange, imagined as meeting points, as public spaces. There is here an interactive process where participation, empathy, and collective intelligence become the keys to understanding places through the human life that they contain. Participation becomes a means of social reintegration that allows often to overcome ethnic tensions in areas, for instance, where you have mixed race populations. Thinking beyond the environmental attributes, Smuts decides on techniques and materials to use with the intention to create employment for the local workers who often suffer from endemic unemployment. That's why local subcontractors and young people are included throughout training workshops or integration projects. In essence, here the architectural project becomes an infrastructure that contributes to a new economy, a dynamic to convey the development of the neighborhood. Sharing the same values surrounds participation. Patrick Bouchon and Loïc Julien and the practice construire in French, meaning build, they advocate HQH standing for high in human quality, paraphrasing the French labelization HQE standing for high environmental quality. To achieve this, they insist on the involvement of future users, allowing residents to gently appropriate the evolution of their own environment via the different stages of the construction process. They therefore establish a sort of participatory democracy, a dialogue between the architects, the builders, the developers, the different and successive users of a project. That take place in the form of construction workshops, on-site training in building trades and self-management of collective space is similar to the previous architects. The construction site is perceived as an open process and becomes a tool that allows the construction process to become a cultural and social act. This leads to an understanding of architect as a mediator who translates the needs of communities and groups into buildings. The construction site is inhabited like a creative workshop and becomes a place where everybody can bring their ideas and contribution, where information is constantly questioned, discussed, and reinterpreted in order for the project to finally emerge. Staying in France, Philippe Madep highlights the need for a technological environmental response as not being the only condition. It's definitely necessary, but not the only condition to talk about sustainability. It is not enough to define an eco-responsible process. And he talks about the responsibility of the architect and the ability at the same time to control the program that he has to design for, and talks about the opportunity to exceed the original demand by adding functions, by adding social functions. He takes, for instance, advantage of the policy in place in France, particularly the local housing plan, that allows to build up to 25% of social housing in each new urban development. And that's what he does. He asks developers to add social housing in every new urban project that he has to work in. By doing that, not only does he facilitate an equitable accession to low-income households, hence accommodating social diversity, but he also combines different housing densities and typologies, therefore controlling urban sprawl. He introduces a time scale. He introduces what he calls Milieu as a spatial, environmental, and social structure that enables the interweaving of spatial scales throughout time frames, as you can see in the diagram. The intention is not to simply position buildings on site, but to develop exchanges with the site, but to implement the buildings on the site and articulate the programs between themselves. In other words, the BILO establishes porosities and forges connections in between the different nodes of the systems that he puts in place. This temporal dimension becomes key in understanding and designing space, since it allows to consider programmatic strategies based on procedures rather than designs. This consideration of time turns public consultation into an element that needs to be met in order to ensure that the project is appropriate and that the future experience of the project is going to be complete. It is exactly via imagining this future experience that the building or the buildings obtain an identity. They manage to be implanted. It's this identity that he refers to as being the idiosyncrasy of architecture. This sense of interconnections and articulations between different scales that transcends Madec's work is also expressed differently in the work of Teddy Cruz and Fona Foreman. In their case, what they do is that they examine local dynamics and possibilities, end up designing policy frameworks. This is, for instance, the example of a project that started around the church, and the church and the people involved became a sort of NGO, and different types of housing and educational relationships and cultural activities were developed around that site, with different housing typologies being enabled thanks to the income generated on the site. The architects, the practice, examine local dynamics and possibilities and end up designing these policy frameworks that combine not only dominant activities, but also marginal activities. Kruth and Foreman, they plan social and cultural programs where housing is thought in parallel of local economies, and that is because it is thanks to the local economies that one can ensure the viability of the living realities of the communities that the architects designed for. Rather than dealing with one specific question, or to put it bluntly, with what in conventional practices would have been the architectural commission, what Teddy Kruth and Fauna Foreman do is that they inspect the reality holistically. They come up with an agenda that clearly targets the demand, the commission, but more importantly, intends to address the problems that the area is suffering from, to address the entire system, to give a solution in an attempt to empower each neighborhood they work with to respond to their own needs. And often that happens via urban acupuncture strategies, via microsystems, via bottom-up agendas that become political tools of micro policies, micro infrastructure, where it is the systems that matter and that lead to the design. Similar to what Madek was doing, who was talking about procedures rather than designs. Thanks for listening to this presentation. Thanks for your time.